Tonight at 10, Boris Johnson's government is accused of presiding over one of the biggest public health failures ever seen in Britain. Thousands of lives were lost because of the delayed lockdown last year, according to 2 Westminster committees.
We too could have avoided the need for a lockdown, but when that became inevitable, we also took too long.
Even though we were one of the first countries in the world to develop a test, we didn't have enough testing capacity.
As the NHS was driven to breaking point, with many patients not surviving, families today are spelling out their anger and sadness.
Not just my family, a lot of other families who are in this situation. It was avoidable if action had been taken sooner.
But the report does praise the UK vaccination programme as highly successful and effective. Also tonight, as companies look for workers, confirmation that the number of job vacancies in the UK is the highest for 20 years. A vision of the future in many more areas as the Environment Agency warns that the UK is not ready for the impact of climate change. And in tonight's football, England draw with Hungary, but the match is marred as visiting fans clashed with police.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel,
Good evening. The decision by Boris Johnson's government to delay the first COVID lockdown was a serious error and part of one of the biggest public health failures in the history of the United Kingdom. That's one of the stark conclusions of a report by 2 parliamentary committees at Westminster. The MPs say that the delay in introducing a lockdown last year cost thousands of lives. Many of those lost were elderly and vulnerable people in care homes. There was also criticism of light-touch border controls, only applied to countries with high infection rates. The start of the NHS test and trace system was said to be slow, uncertain and often chaotic. There were unacceptably high death rates among ethnic minority groups and among people with learning disabilities and autism. But the committee did praise the UK's vaccination programme as a highly successful and effective initiative. Now, the report's focus is on England. The MPs did not look at steps taken individually by Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. Our health editor Huw Pym has more details.
A deadly new virus. Hospital staff facing unprecedented challenges. The most comprehensive report so far on the official response to the COVID crisis says serious mistakes were made and different policies could have saved lives.
He was relatively young and totally fit and healthy with no underlying health conditions.
Phil got COVID in March last year. His condition worsened and he died in April. His daughter Sarah believes an earlier lockdown restricting the spread of the virus might have made all the difference.
I do believe that a lot of, not just my family, a lot of other families who are in this situation, it was avoidable if action had been taken sooner, and perhaps a little bit more of a responsible approach had been taken sooner.
The report looks at decisions around the timing of the March lockdown. It says full restrictions came too late because the government's scientific advisors wanted only to slow down the spread of the virus rather than stop it.
Most people, the vast majority of people, get a mild illness to build up some degree of herd immunity as well.
An acceptance of herd immunity and widespread infections was the attitude, according to the report, with groupthink among ministers and officials.
The virus is deadly here, look.
Events like the Cheltenham Racing Festival in mid-March, the report adds, may have spread the virus.
I think there is an issue there of hindsight, because at the time of the first lockdown, the expectation was that the tolerance in terms of how long people would live with lockdown for was a far shorter period than actually has proven to be the case.
The second lockdown came in November. MPs say a so-called circuit breaker in England in September might have slowed the virus, though the emergence of a new variant wasn't then known. Labour said the report's stark conclusions couldn't be ignored.
To use language as that this was one of the worst public health failures in the UK, that is a damning indictment. And my thoughts are with the families who've lost people because of these failures.
The MP's report is highly critical of the test and trace system in England. It says it was set up much too late and that capacity should have been built up much earlier in the pandemic, in line with some other countries. Halting community testing in the early weeks had cost lives, according to the report. Just one of the government's failings, said the former Downing Street advisor who'd given evidence to MPs.
Me and others put into place work to try and improve the system in 2020 after the first wave. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister, being the joke that he is, has not pushed that work through.
The COVID pressure in care homes is examined in detail. The MPs say that sending elderly people from hospitals into care homes without prior testing may have been understandable, but it contributed to the spread of the virus. Staff entering care homes also may have carried infections. Staff shortages and problems getting PPE hadn't helped.
In Hong Kong and Germany, they took more precautions early on to protect care homes.
BBC News, I'm sure lay with the headlines this hour. Authorities in Turkey have boosted security. BBC News, I'm sure lay with the headlines.
The report says vaccine development has been one of the most successful initiatives in UK science. Early investment by the government in research and development is praised by MPs. The vaccine task force being set up outside government is described as a masterstroke, with the success of the vaccine programme said to have redeemed many failings elsewhere. The report praises the response of the NHS to the pandemic, with a rapid increase in critical care beds. But it notes that even before COVID struck, most hospitals were running at close to full capacity, and that meant that services including some cancer care were put on hold. The ensuing backlog has become one of the enduring legacies of the pandemic. And the MPs note that BAME communities experienced higher levels of severe illness and death, which highlighted inequalities in society. The government's overall response to the report is that they've been consistently guided by scientific experts and are committed to learning lessons from the pandemic. Huw Edwards, BBC News.
Reaction to the report has varied, from demands to bring forward the start of the public inquiry promised by the Prime Minister, to an insistence from some Conservative MPs that while Boris Johnson was ultimately responsible for the actions of his government, he did receive some expert advice which turned out to be wrong. Our correspondent Sophie Hutchinson has been speaking to some of those who've been most affected by the pandemic and by the decisions made.
Some light relief in Nottingham this afternoon, but just months ago, care home residents were among the worst hit by the pandemic, according to today's report. Here there were multiple deaths, and shortages of PPE and lack of medical support pushed staff to breaking point.
It was horrendous. I think everybody was just panic stations. Everybody's job kind of quickly evolved from whatever they were doing to helping out. The staff were panicking, you know, some of them are very vulnerable themselves, they've got vulnerable families. It was difficult.
It was extremely scary and hugely emotionally, physically draining.
Failure to lock down early enough and slow the spread of the virus heaped huge pressure on the NHS and its staff, like Mark, who was working in A&E.
What was it about the British government that meant they thought that we were invincible to this thing? You know, it was infuriating seeing Boris Johnson on TV and early on saying, "Oh, I shook hands with everyone." It was like completely against all the guidance that was out at the time, and it was almost making a joke out of it, and it was infuriating. You know, that was entirely the wrong message.
Safia Na's father, who was 68 with no underlying health conditions, was one of a significant number of people from black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds to die in the pandemic. MPs today said it's a result of the inequalities in our society.
He'd never been ill in my living memory, so it was his first time in hospital, and it was terrifying. The government has actually spoken about levelling up and about not leaving no community behind, I think was the words that they used, but that's very vague. We really need to see actual change.
But while MPs have called the government's early response to the virus one of the worst public health failures, they've praised the vaccination programme as one of the best initiatives. Paul Luttrell, who has cancer, got COVID-19 despite being vaccinated, but his doctors told him the jab actually saved his life.
After surviving the cancer scare and still having it, knowing that my life's maybe shorter, getting COVID was just sort of the icing on the cake, really. You know, and to survive that, and the staff, the nurses, because I'd had my virus injections, that I had that chance, you know, it gave me the support that my body needed. Without it, it would have killed me.
But while many have recovered from the virus and are now protected by the vaccine, millions of others are still coming to terms with the profound effect it's had on them and the lives of their loved ones. Sophie Hutchinson, BBC News.
Let's go live to Westminster and talk to our political correspondent, Damien Grammaticus. Damien, as we've spelled out, you know, lots of this criticism is extremely serious, levelled at the government and elsewhere. What's been the response there?
That's right, Huw, and it's hard to dismiss as well, because this was chaired by two former Conservative cabinet ministers. They heard from more than 50 witnesses at the heart of decision-making. 22 MPs agreed it, and they point to the fact the UK has one of the highest per capita death tolls in all rich countries, 150,000 deaths associated with COVID. So what the government has been saying is repeating its defence, saying it followed the science. But you heard the report saying that was flawed at the beginning and led to a delayed lockdown. It should have been questioned. The government's been saying that it acted to protect the NHS. The report says that happened when the NHS looked like possibly being overwhelmed. The government says that there was limited advice and information early on. The report says they should have looked to countries that were controlling the virus in East Asia. Now, there will be a public inquiry next year, but now the government is coming under pressure from bereaved families who say that inquiry should have tougher legal powers. They believe there have been thousands of unnecessary deaths and say they want to prevent any further avoidable ones. Huw.
Damien, many thanks again. Damien Grammaticus with the latest there at Westminster. Let's have a look then at the latest official figures on the pandemic in the UK. There were 38,520 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. And that means on average there were over 38,600 new cases per day in the past week. As of Monday, there were 7,000 people in hospital in the UK with coronavirus. Another 181 deaths have been recorded. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive test, which means on average there were 114 deaths per day in the past week. There's now been a total of nearly 138,000 deaths. On vaccinations, 85.6% of the population aged 12 and over have had their first dose of a vaccine, and 78.6% have been double vaccinated. The number of job vacancies in the UK is highest for 20 years, and the latest official figures show that 1.1 million jobs were available between July and September. The retail sector and motor vehicle repair businesses were among those with a sharp rise in jobs to fill. Our business editor, Simon Jack, reports.
Help wanted. Across the UK, there are a record 1.1 million job vacancies. This large food wholesaler and distributor is seeing fierce competition to attract and retain staff.
All around here, there's all different companies recruiting at the same time. We've recruited over the last 4 months 700 people, but on the other side, 400 people have gone to work for other companies. So we've got up in training costs, we've got 15 to 20% labour costs that we've increased. On top of that, retention bonuses. Everything is just making it really difficult for us to service our customers.
Brakes is training some of its workers, like Dean, to move out of the warehouse and behind the wheel, where the shortages are acute and the terms on offer are getting more attractive.
It makes you feel appreciated. Yeah. You know, as I think for a long while, drivers haven't been appreciated as much as they should have been. And I think the industry now has realised that to retain people, you have to offer the right money.
Higher pay offers in sectors like this are evident in today's report. Average wages are 6% higher than last year, but that was when many workers were on furlough or reduced hours. If you adjust for that, wage rises are closer to 4%, higher than inflation, which is currently at 3.2%, but that is expected to rise.
It's not just the wage bill that's going up in companies like this. There's the fuel cost in the supply chain, soaring energy bills to heat or cool their buildings. All of that will feed through into higher prices inevitably, which means inflation will offset some of the wage rise that some people are getting and make life very difficult for those that aren't getting them.
Construction is also feeling the squeeze. Firms are poaching staff from each other with offers of more money. But paying more doesn't mean walls get built any faster.
Talk me through the programme.
The boss of this construction firm says they are having to pay more, but they're not getting more productivity bang for the higher wage buck.
In order for businesses to be sustainable and to grow, particularly as a small business, we need our productivity to be reflected in the increase in wages that we're paying.
The government said it wants a higher wage, higher skill economy. At the moment, there's only evidence of the first part of that. One very encouraging aspect of today's release was the low level of redundancy notices firms were issuing, allaying fears that the end of the furlough scheme at the end of September would trigger an immediate rise in job losses. The government will argue that that means the furlough scheme was £70 billion well spent. Simon Jack, BBC News.
The UK's largest commercial port says that the supply chain crisis has caused a logjam of shipping containers. The port of Felixstowe in Suffolk, which handles over a third of the UK's freight container traffic, blamed the busy pre-Christmas period and a shortage of lorry drivers. But it said the situation has been improving somewhat over the past few days. The world's finance ministers are meeting in the US this week. The International Monetary Fund has warned that the global economic recovery from the pandemic is getting weaker. Let's talk to our economics editor, Faisal Islam, who's in Washington. Faisal, tell us more about the prospects as they see them.
Hi, Huw. Yes, the post-lockdown recovery is getting messy. That's the message from this important meeting of central bank governors and world's finance ministers here in Washington. Of course, the situation right now is better than it was a year ago in the depth of the pandemic. You can see that in the growth numbers, you can see it in the jobs numbers too. But that good news is not evenly spread around the world. Developing countries, particularly those that can't get their hands on enough vaccine, well, they are particularly at risk there. So we have that situation not just in developing countries, for advanced economies too. The IMF is warning them to be very, very vigilant, and that includes the United Kingdom, about this issue of inflation. And that's because those supply chain worries, and you were talking about Felixstowe there, those supply chain worries are proving more persistent in ports, in our truck stops, on our shopping shelves, and also in those job vacancy figures too. That sets up a dilemma for the likes of the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey, who is here meeting counterparts, and it means for him that he has to decide when interest rates go up. The markets, which were anticipating this would not happen until the end of next year, are now penciling in that it could happen this year in December. So the recovery is important, but there are key trade-offs between inflation and interest rates.
Faisal, many thanks again. Faisal Islam with the latest thoughts there in Washington. The United Kingdom is not ready for the impact of climate change. That's the warning from the Environment Agency. It says hundreds could die in floods unless the places where people live, work and travel are made more resilient to the increasingly volatile weather. The data suggests even a small rise in global temperatures could mean that by 2050, rivers could peak at levels around 30% higher than today, posing a huge risk of flooding. But in summer, it's a very different picture, with droughts and river levels dropping dramatically and a threat then to water supplies. Towards the end of the century, sea levels in the Thames estuary could be almost half a metre higher, meaning a bigger Thames barrier would be needed. Our science editor David Schuckman has the story.
A street in Cardiff became a dangerous river earlier this month after a massive downpour. There was a similar scene in Newcastle after torrential rain there. And around the same time, London was engulfed, raising questions about how we'll cope as climate change makes the weather even more violent. But the biggest shock came in Germany last July. A surge of water tore through communities. 200 people were killed, and the fear is of disaster here on a similar scale.
The weather events that we saw in Europe this summer could happen here in England, and we need to be ready to save lives. We need to recognise that it's adapt or die.
The Environment Agency is being deliberately blunt so that its recommendations are heard. For homeowners and businesses to take basic steps to make their properties safe. To restore landscapes like forests so they hold rainwater before it causes floods. And for bigger investments by government in defences that can handle projected rises in sea levels. Already the Thames barrier defending London is being closed far more often than planned. A trend that'll continue as the polar ice keeps melting, raising the height of the oceans. How long do you reckon it'll work protecting London? With its network of tunnels under the river, the barrier was designed decades ago and may not be big enough in future. The great steel gates are holding back a phenomenal volume of seawater that would otherwise enter the city and potentially cause disaster, which is why climate change matters so much here. They're constantly watching the projections for how much the sea is going to rise. It's also why we'll probably need a bigger barrier by 2070. But some stretches of the coast are not so lucky. Homes in Norfolk are being lost to the sea. The Environment Agency says it can't protect everyone. But since last year, when I met Lorna Bevan-Thompson, a local business owner, the waves have come much nearer.
They're saying that we've got billions of money available, but it's not coming to us. And our coastline is getting eroded daily, and it's irreparable damage.
In some parts of the UK, the challenge will be too little water. A growing population and drier summers will strain supplies. The government says it is preparing the country for a more turbulent climate, and it wants world leaders to discuss the risks when they meet at the UN summit in Glasgow next month. David Schuckman, BBC News.
The annual New Year's Eve firework display over the River Thames in central London has been cancelled for a second year because of COVID. Up to 100,000 people usually attend the event, which is broadcast around the world. City Hall said it was cancelled due to the uncertainty caused by the pandemic. Lord Frost, the minister who represents the UK in talks on the Brexit settlement, has called for significant changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, that's the deal which ensures that there's no need for checks along the land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The protocol was agreed and signed by both the UK and the EU, but Lord Frost now says he sees a better way forward. The agreement meant that goods flowing between Northern Ireland and the Republic would not be subject to border checks, but checks would be needed on goods entering Northern Ireland from England, Scotland and Wales. Inspections would take place at Northern Ireland's ports. Well, now, that's prompted criticism that this arrangement has in effect created a border in the Irish Sea. And the government's critics say that this was perfectly clear when that deal was signed. The UK also wants to change the role of the European Court of Justice in overseeing these arrangements. Lord Frost said today he wanted to amend the protocol and support the Good Friday Peace Agreement in Northern Ireland.
The protocol is not working. It's completely lost consent in one community in Northern Ireland. It's not doing the thing it was set up to do, protect the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. In fact, doing the opposite. It has to change.
Lord Frost there speaking earlier today. The European Union will be setting out its proposals tomorrow. So let's join our Europe editor, Katja Adler, in Berlin. Katja, tell us a little more of what we can expect then in terms of a response.
Well, I tell you what we won't expect, Huw, and that is that we really are on the edge of a looming trade war between the EU and the UK. The focus in European capitals just is on soaring gas prices, for example. Here in Berlin, it's about forming a government after the elections. But that said, there really are definite tensions over the protocol, which were alluded to today by Lord Frost. The EU tomorrow is going to set out what it says are practical solutions to concrete problems. So it's going to look, for example, at reducing the number of checks on goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, making sure that medicines can move smoothly between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And the EU will pledge to engage more actively, more frequently with the administration in Northern Ireland and with businesses there as well. What it will not do is to address the demand made by Lord Frost today to get rid of the European Court of Justice's oversight role in the protocol, and that is, the EU says that this is not just any old international treaty, it's an exceptional treaty looking at Northern Ireland after Brexit. The European Court of Justice has oversight over the single market for goods and the customs union that Northern Ireland has remained a part of. It says it's a red line, but for now both sides say they'll keep talking, but Huw, the potential is there for things to get a lot messier.
Katja, many thanks again. Katja Adler there, our Europe editor in Berlin. The Queen has attended a service of thanksgiving at Westminster Abbey to mark the centenary of the Royal British Legion. Her Majesty was seen using a walking stick as she arrived and left the Abbey. It's the first time that she's done so at a major public event. The Royal British Legion is the largest armed forces charity in the UK and organises the annual Poppy Appeal. Let's look at tonight's football then, and England drew with Hungary in their World Cup qualifier, but the match was marred by some clashes between visiting fans and police. Scotland were playing the Faroe Islands and Northern Ireland lost to Bulgaria. Joe Wilson has this report.
England versus Hungary at Wembley, one team taking the knee. In the crowd, one banner symbolising objection to an act of anti-racism. Early in the game, spectators in the Hungarian section clashed with police. This was a reaction, police say, after they arrested a man for racially aggravated abuse towards the steward. It was the backdrop. It is the context. On the pitch, there was a penalty for Hungary given for this challenge by Luke Shaw. The height of the foot was enough, and England were behind.
And it's an unexpected turn of events.
Well, after the plain sailing of their qualifying, now they had to respond. Reaction from John Stones, 1-1 at half-time. Stones came close to winning it. England's draw will require analysis. What happened in the crowd will, say the FA, be investigated. 200 miles north of home, Scotland and their followers knew the reputation of the Faroe Islands. Population of 50,000, almost 1-0 up here. Thank you, Craig Gordon in goal. Scotland's position, all their optimism demanded a win. There were 4 minutes left. There was Lyndon Dykes. One goal was as good as 10. Qualifying ambition sustained. Northern Ireland's focus lies on tournaments beyond 2022. They led in Bulgaria, lost 2-1. Well, more experience for challenges to come. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
That's it from us. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.